All right, let's have a look at William Wordsworth's grand attempt at the epic, namely his work, The Prelude, or as the subtitle indicates probably more accurately with respect to the subject matter, The Growth of a Poet's Mind, and it is entitled an autobiographical poem. And with this, we need to note that Wordsworth's poem here, which we saw in its nascent form in the so-called two-part prelude, which we looked at a few classes ago, Wordsworth has now expanded upon that. But as the title indicates, the prelude, this was not originally supposed to be the grand epic that he had intended to write. It was merely the prelude to that grand epic. The prelude was just a poetic exercise, as it were, in that process. But as it turns out, this ended up being his closest approximation to an epic. And what he planned on as that grand epic, namely The Recluse or something of that variety, never really came to gain the full fruition that we find here in the Prelude. And so the Prelude is commonly seen as Wordsworth's great poem. He wrote it during, I think, he began in Germany when he was on the continent in 1798, and he concluded it somewhere around 1804, 1805, when he first published the edition that became popular, and then he continued on revising it and republished it, as I said to you, in 1850, at which time it was considerably more orthodox in its formulation, so more explicit references to God, and more theistic in its presentation rather than the panentheism, which is more characteristic of the earlier versions of the poem, and which, quite frankly, to my mind, make it more powerful. That is the panentheism, and or in the sense that it does simply more accurately reflect the sort of processes that Mr. Wordsworth is describing in his poetry. Whatever one makes of them, it seems to me, my impression is that the original, whatever I think of the theology, seems to actually have greater poetic power. But the prelude, as we have it here, is writing in the autobiographical vein, as we see here. This had become increasingly common amongst writers of the 18th century and so forth. The most famous instance of that is probably Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confession, written as a clear analogy to Augustine's famous Confessions, which were a sort of a spiritual autobiography recounting how he had come to faith, and giving extracts from his life and the life of the man Augustine as opposed to the man before that. Rousseau wrote something in a similar sort of vein, and we can find similar poetic attempts in the works of William Hazlitt, and for that matter, of his Wordsworth friend Charles Lamb. But the autobiographical vein here reflects the subject matter of the poem, namely his own mind. And so with that, we note an aspect of romantic epics in general, which I noted to you last time, which is that the events being depicted and the landscape, as it were, is an internal one. And so for all of the descriptive passages that Wordsworth will present to us, his reflection upon the description is as important, and in fact more important, than the events that he describes. And so the actions, so the effect of that is to rob the poem of action in its traditional sense. We don't get the sense of, which we often do in classical literature, of being present and watching a scene for ourselves and having it shown to us rather than told to us. We get instead, in Wordsworth, and then again, characteristically in Romantic and post-Romantic epics, them telling us rather than showing us as a didactic approach, and really as a reflection of the subject matter that they deem to be most important, namely the development of their own minds. And of course, that's something that we cannot see. It simply has to be told to us. And so whatever one makes of that, I think there is certainly a loss in the visible aspect of Romantic poetry and Romantic epics that makes it hard to follow. And I think it probably reduces its audience to those who are more reflective and more prone to reflect upon themselves. It's sometimes called the psychological bent, and obviously it is in the sense that it's introspective and looking upon oneself, whether it is actually the psyche or if it's the intellect or what it is, the feelings. Um, it's difficult to actually put your finger on exactly what it is that the poet is describing. Wordsworth describes it as his mind, but the mind which he describes seems as strongly connected to the external world, and is moved by it so as to speak almost more about the passions or the feelings than simply the mind. But it's in this period that we note that there's a great deal of conceptual change and a movement, among other things, away from that word which I just used, the passions, towards a word which we now use frequently without actually much awareness that it is an oddity in terms of its register, namely the word emotions. We now speak of our emotions and we don't speak of the passions. Passions are the classical word for the bodily response to other things in terms of the thumos and so forth. The emotions are something that come from within and are expressed outward. And M.H. Abrams, in his magisterial work, The Mirror and the Lamp, I think quite ably describes this shift in the Romantic period to a sort of the claim of an inner light, which is whose effulgence is the main subject matter of the poem, as opposed to the mirror, which had been previously held up to nature to represent our minds. We are essentially the same. So they still hold on to the Christian view of a common human nature, which contemporary approaches to the humanities tend to deny, at least if not explicitly, although often it is explicitly, then certainly operatively. And so what they understand is that, and I'm going to quote Northrop Frye here, the great Canadian literary critic who wrote his introductory work on Blake's work, but also on the Bible as literature. There's an understanding that we don't only live in the natural world like the animals do, nakedly, but within a mythological universe, a body of assumptions and beliefs developed from his existential concerns. And so most of this, although we hold it unconsciously, Fry says, we can recognize it in art or literature. So it's a subconscious or even an unconscious mythological universe that we share in common, which we cannot see per se, and yet we all understand. That's the universality. It's the archetypal way in which Romantic poetry tends to operate, and it appeals to those sorts of experiences through reflections on the mind. So with all that said, let me begin and try and get through some of the first 4 books. That was the task today. By reading a few lines. And I said that it was an epic, and I wanted to, in the Miltonic mode, and let's talk about some of the features that we can note at the outset that will give rise to that observation. Then, so book first, introduction, and then it's chronologically told. So childhood and school time. Oh, there is blessing in this gentle breeze. A visitant that while it fans my cheek doth seem half conscious of the joy it brings from the green fields, and from yon azure sky. Whate'er its mission, the soft breeze can come to none more grateful than to me, escaped from the vast city, where I long had pined a discontented sojourner. now free, free as a bird to settle where I will. What dwelling shall receive me? In what vale shall be my harbor? Underneath what grove shall I take up my home? And what clear stream shall with its murmur lull me into rest? The earth is all before me. With a heart joyous, nor scared at its own liberty, I look about. And would the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. I breathe again. Trances of thought and mountings of the mind come fast upon me. It is shaken off, that burthen of my own unnatural self, the heavy weight of many a weary day not mine, and such as were not made for me. Long months of peace, if such bold word accord with any promises of human life, long months of ease and undisturbed delight are mine in prospect. Whither shall I turn? By road or pathway, or through trackless field, uphill or down, or shall some floating thing upon the river point me out my course? So these are the words with which Wordsworth introduces his poem, the first 30 lines. And in this, we note a few things. Something of an invocation. Now, it is not something that Wordsworth actually calls upon, nor even describes as a muse here, although he will later on in the poem refer to the muse. But what we note here is a spirit present, and the spirit here is one that is in nature, namely the breeze, the gentle breeze with which the poem begins. In Greek, the word ruach, which is there for breath, is also there for a wind. And often is connected with the Spirit. Of course, the Holy Spirit, when it comes upon the apostles in the book of Acts, comes with a rushing wind. This is the sign, and of course, with flames and tongues of fire. But the wind is commonly associated with inspiration. Wordsworth simply puts it simply in naturalistic terms here. But we can see in Wordsworth's poem in general that the wind, and I want you to pay attention to the wind in Wordsworth's poem, is not simply a naturalistic description. It does have the implications of inspiration and a sort of a natural supernaturalism that comes there. And note that he had escaped from the vast city being a place in Wordsworth's poetic vocabulary of a dead or a death to inspiration and to his true humanity. But he looks out, and when he looks out, he looks upon a scene which is a prospect, and he asks a series of questions, questions that are, of course, rhetorical questions, the questions being asked to himself. But the lines that he uses here not only are redolent of the lines that Milton would have used at the outset of his work in reference to the muse, although not even particularly accurately there in that sense. But I'm suggesting there's a veiled reference to a muse here and a reference to the wind. But what is clear is a reference to the conclusion of Milton's Paradise Lost Book 12, where, if you recall, at the end of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise, the two are given a prospect from the mountain about the promised land that they're going to go into. They're being expelled from paradise. And yet the two shed tears at the prospect of leaving Eden. They have no choice but to do so. They're being chased out by the angels with their fiery swords. But they look upon the land in which they are about to enter, and they look upon it with Providence as their guide, we're told by Milton. And here Milton, or rather Wordsworth, echoes these words in his own lines with line 14, 15, with a heart joyous nor scared at its own liberty I look about, and should the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. Now, of course, in terms of biblical echoes here, the people of Israel who were led out of the land of Egypt were led by a fiery pillar by night and a cloud, a dark, thick cloud, thick darkness by day before them. Wordsworth is obviously aware of that and echoing it here, but also even the prospect from the mountain which Moses himself saw when he was not allowed to go into the promised land. He was allowed to look upon it from a great height. Likewise, Wordsworth here is looking at the prospect upon which he looks out and wonders where he shall go, where he will be led. Whereas providence in Milton's sense is being led by God himself, a personal being, here it's being led by a natural object, namely the cloud, which is blown by this gentle breeze that he speaks to at the outset. So whereas the reference in the book of Acts to the work of the Holy Spirit is a rather violent wind, and not a gentle breeze, Wordsworth's terms are more in keeping with his general emphasis on something that is almost imperceptible and yet is determinative of what happens. And this is the gentle breeze that he senses in the landscape. And we'll see that it has a corresponding breeze within him as well, which reflects his view of creativity. And I'll get to that now. But having said that, he wants to first address himself to the political theme, which also is part of this grand epic, namely that of liberty. Now, I think I'll probably have to say more about the Romantics' notion of liberty, because it does, this word liberty, like many important concepts, has different connotations depending on the author. So we will have to look into that further. But for now, we'll simply note that he capitalizes the word liberty, and it is a matter of utmost importance to him, like all of those in his generation, because of course it's one of the hallmarks of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Those are the three words that were cried out by the French revolutionaries. They wanted liberty. What sort of liberty? What are the connotations of liberty? As I say, we'll look at that further, probably in book 8 or thereabouts, when he gets to the French Revolution and talks about these things and makes them his own. But for now, we'll just read. Dear liberty, yet what would it avail but for a gift that consecrates the joy? For I, methought, while the sweet breath of heaven was blowing on my body — now note the association of heaven with that breeze that was in the landscape — was blowing on my body, felt within a correspondent breeze. So an internal movement that gently moved with quickening virtue, but is now become a tempest, a redundant energy, vexing its own creation, thanks to both, and their congenial powers, that, while they join in breaking up a long-continued frost, bring with them vernal promises. The hope of active days urged on by flying hours, days of sweet leisure, taxed with patient thought abstruse, nor wanting punctual service high, matins and vespers of harmonious verse. Now he concludes in line 46 here with Christian language of a worship service. And in the Anglican liturgy, the morning office service is called the matins, the evening service called the vespers. And of course, Wordsworth is speaking of his holy subject matter in Christian language here. And this is characteristic of Wordsworth in particular. He's very much in tune with the Anglican Book of Common Prayer and with the liturgical elements, and I think that those are infused within his poetry. So it's really, even if we see a move away from Orthodox Christianity, nonetheless, the poem cannot really be understood without an Anglican liturgical mindset within the reader's mind. And this is problematic for those of us who have not got that background when we come to reading the poem. Wordsworth is very much an English poet, and perhaps even an Anglican poet for that matter. But I can't do anything about that if you haven't got that background, other than to alert you to the fact that this is what's going on. So that he talks about that. Now he talked about the breeze, but now he talks about the correspondent breeze. Now this is how the characteristic features of the two-part prelude are brought out here. Remember, I talked about it as a descriptive, characteristically begins with a description of a landscape and then the reflection upon the poet's response to that landscape. And the two are almost, they're not identical, but the two are presented as almost a continuum. There's a breeze from without, there's a breeze from within corresponding to it. And with that, Wordsworth's doctrine of creation comes along with it. It's, to use his phrase, and I believe it's from Tintern Abbey, half created, half perceived. And it might be the other end, half perceived, half created. So there's an element in which we passively receive inspiration from without, and there's an element in which we actively are involved in responding to it. And with this, Wordsworth is actually pushing strongly against the associationist psychology of his day, which suggested the mind was simply a passive vehicle for external things. And in that sense, just simply free will is gone with it. Wordsworth very much disagrees with this, thinks that there is such a thing as human freedom, and particularly identifies it with the creative power of the imagination. And so really, I think for all of the poets of this period, when we're speaking of the importance of the imagination, we need to recognize they see it as the means to assert what is distinctively human about human nature, even while identifying human nature with the other order of nature. So they want to hold on to something that is distinctively human, which is the freedom that human beings have, not simply to respond to sensory apparatus, which is what the scientific community has been promoting in this day, following, as I say, Isaac Newton and the associationist psychology that arises out of that. And okay, with that said, let me go on. Now he addresses the person to whom he's writing the poem, which is his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And so I'll move on with that, and then we'll try and move forward a little bit more quickly. Thus far, O friend, did I, not used to make a present joy the matter of a song, pour forth that day my soul in measured strains that would not be forgotten, and are here recorded. To the open fields I told a prophecy. Poetic numbers came spontaneously to clothe in priestly robe a renovated spirit singled out. Such hope was mine. For holy services, my own voice cheered me, and far more the mind's internal echo of the imperfect sound. To both I listened, drawing from them both a cheerful confidence in things to come. Note once again Wordsworth's reference to a sense of a vocation here to something akin to holy orders, something akin to a priesthood. Here he's the priesthood to a new religion which he himself is the chief devotee, and is trying to, again, bring to the conscience of and minds of others. And it's noteworthy, again, and Coleridge particularly talks about this in his Biographia Literaria, that Wordsworth's poetry had a particularly strong and powerful effect on not only the intelligent intellectuals of his day, but particularly those who had religious sensibilities. So Wordsworth was touching on something about human nature, namely its capacity and its distinctively free will, which the animal kingdom does not possess. And I think we need to laud Wordsworth for that. On the other hand, he seems to collapse it with the natural world in a way that makes it difficult to actually understand what he's speaking of sometimes. But he speaks on, he goes on here, and I'll skip over some of that, and then I want to move on to a metaphor that he uses, which I would make a bigger deal of on a course on the Romantics in general, rather than the Romantic epic. But I do want to draw your attention to it here, and it's in lines. It's actually in line 95, but I'll read a few lines before that. 93. He says, "It was a splendid evening, and my soul once more made trial of her strength, nor lacked Aeolian visitations. But the harp was soon defrauded, and the banded host of harmony dispersed in straggling sounds, and lastly, utter silence. This reference to an Aeolian harp, you might want to look it up. I think you can probably these days find it referred to on Wikipedia or something like that and see a vision of it. An Aeolian harp is a stringed instrument that produces musical sounds when the air blows through it. So it's not an instrument that people uh, pluck or stroke or do anything to. It's something that the air blows through and it makes a certain noise. Now, in the 18th century, it was used as a symbol of poetic creation, or even of the poet himself. He was like an Aeolian harp. And so note that in that element, there's an element of a loss of volition, a capacity for the expression of free will in that. And again, that reflects the associationist and deterministic psychology of the 18th century, which has not gone away, by the way. So in contemporary psychology, there's a great deal of debate over what constitutes the psyche. Is the psyche the mind? Is the psyche the soul? Is the psyche the brain? For those of you who've done classes with me before, I say to you that this is one of the great problems for the discipline of psychology. If it purports to be a science of the psyche, it has to identify what the psyche is and be agreed upon amongst its practitioners over what exactly constitutes the subject of science. And yet, when we look at the various options amongst the psychologists, there is no such consensus. Indeed, there are positions that are radically opposed to one another. The mind is an immaterial object. The brain is a material object. The mind it works through the reason and through arguably the imagination, its capacity for an intellectual exercise emancipated from the material world and from deterministic causes, and is only guided by the laws of logic, etc. That's what the mind would be. And so when Wordsworth refers to the mind, he is leaning more to the traditional understanding of the psyche. And even of the soul. Now, the soul in Christian conceptualization, to problematize it a bit, is not the Platonic notion of a soul, which is once again an immaterial object, a disembodied entity. But in Christian theology, the soul constitutes both the mind and the body. It's the composite of the two. The soul is the whole person. And in fact, it's the essence of that whole person, which includes the body. Now, in post-Descartes, there's a tendency to revert back to something akin to the Cartesian notion of the mind being a disembodied immaterial entity, or a res cogitans, a thinking substance, as Descartes calls it, which works through the body, the res extensa, which is the extension of that mind. And so what we get with Cartesian understandings of psychology is really a very ghostly understanding of human nature that disputes the idea that the body is connected to it, because again, Descartes' a rationalist. Whereas post Newton, there's a strong tendency to associate human nature with the rest of the empirically observable world, which makes it a material object and a material substance and is acted upon accordingly. And so everything happens through the senses. And that would dispute the legitimacy or even the reality of that noumenal world to which Descartes appeals, and Plato for that matter. But this dispute about what the nature of the psyche is, whether it's an immaterial object, the mind, or it's a material object, the brain, continues to this day in the discipline of psychology to some degree. And you can see this simply by fact that people who have now psychological problems, mental illnesses, are treated almost exclusively, although not exclusively, but primarily through means of chemical substances. And I have no particular problem with that, in the sense that from a Christian perspective, if we understand that the human soul is a composite of mind and body, then we're going to understand that, of course, chemical balances, etc., could be a factor in mental health. On the other hand, to reduce it to those things, as some people do, seems to me to be extremely problematic for a Christian notion of human nature, and it denies what is distinctively human about a human being, namely the capacity for reasoning. And with that, for logical disputation, for discussion, for the very things that make for the human community, namely the commonality that comes from a common shared world of language and myth and story and communication. That's the means of union of separate things. But I digress here simply, but this reference to an Aeolian harp is a reference to the favored analogy or metaphor of the poet in 18th century associationist psychology. So the poet is like this natural harp through which the wind blows, and who knows where the wind comes from, but it makes a noise in response to that. And he says that he did not lack, rather, Aeolian visitation, so that there was a breeze from within, and yet that harp was soon defrauded. So it lost its corresponding capacity. And he says in response to that, be it so. Why think of anything but present good? So, like a homebound laborer, 101, I pursued my way beneath the mellowing sun, that shed mild influence, nor left in me one wish again to bend the Sabbath of that time to a servile yoke. What need of many words? A pleasant loitering journey. Now this, again, I want to say one final thing about this. Wordsworth will repeatedly, in this very long, and some might say long-winded poem, talk about the inability of words to articulate the spiritual truth to which he is going to testify, namely the importance of what is going on within him. He's going to go on a great length about it, as I say, and describe his feelings, but he's at the end of the day is going to want to say that words cannot express what is inexpressible, and therefore the greatest expression of these feelings that he says are decisive to his human nature are expressed in failure. And failure is expressed in various forms, but one of the primary ones being through silence. Silence in his work and breaches in the narrative. But I'll leave over that and pick up what he writes from his poetic subject matter, which again directs us to the fact that this is an epic in Wordsworth's own mind. And he talks about what he had considered writing upon at one stage before finally landing upon the subject matter that he is now writing about. He says that he looked for things that would build up a poet's praise. And he says, time, place, and manners do I seek, line 158, and these are found in plenteous store, but nowhere such as may be singled out with steady choice. No little band of yet remembered names, whom I in perfect confidence might hope to summon back from lonesome banishment and make them dwellers in the hearts of men. Remember, Wordsworth wants not only to write an epic poem, he wants to inspire a generation, his generation, in the same way that Milton would have influenced his generation through his poetry, in the same way that Virgil would have through his grand epic, in the same way Homer would have through his. So by writing an epic, he wants not a small elite audience, he wants a grand audience. He wants the whole of humanity as his audience. And so he searches for a theme, and he says that he will settle, perhaps, on some British theme, some old, line 168, romantic tale by Milton left unsung, more often turning to some gentle place within the groves of chivalry. I pipe to shepherd swains, or seated harp in hand, amid reposing nights by a river side or fountain, listen to the grave reports of dire enchantments faced and overcome by the strong mind and tales of warlike feats. where spear encountered spear and sword with sword fought, as if conscious of the blazonry that the shield bore, so glorious was the strife. Whence inspiration for a song that wins or winds through ever-changing scenes of votive quest, wrongs to redress, harmonious tribute paid to patient courage and unblemished truth, to firm devotion, zeal unquenchable, and Christian meekness, hallowing faithful loves. Sometimes more sternly moved, I would relate how vanquished Mithridates northward passed, and hidden in the cloud of years became Odin, the father of a race by whom perished the Roman Empire. So he could have written on the king of Pontus on the Black Sea. Let's talk about this. How the friends and followers of Sertorius out of Spain flying found shelter in the Fortunate Isles, and left their usages, their arts and laws. He could have written on this. Or he could have written on the Frenchman, or on Gustavus, or on Wallace, fought for Scotland. I'm skipping over lines here. 215. William Wallace fought for freedom against the English, left the name of Wallace to be found like a wild flower all over his dear country. He left the deeds of Wallace like a family of ghosts to people the steep rocks and river banks of her natural sanctuaries, with a local soul of independence and stern liberty. Sometimes, he writes, it suits me better to invent a tale from my own heart, more near akin to my own passions and habitual thoughts. Some variegated story, in the main lofty, but the unsubstantial structure melts before the very sun that brightens it, mist into air dissolving. Then a wish, my last and favorite aspiration, mounts with yearning towards some philosophic song of truth that cherishes our daily life, with meditations passionate from deep recesses in man's heart, immortal verse thoughtfully fitted to the Orphean lyre. But from this awful burthen I fully soon take refuge and beguile myself with trust that mellower years will bring a riper mind with clearer insight. Thus my days are passed in contradiction, with no skill to part, vague longing, haply bred by want of power from paramount impulse not to be withstood, a timorous capacity from prudence, from circumspection, infinite delay. So he talks about this, the challenges that he has in coming upon his subject matter. Like Milton does in his book 9 of Paradise Lost, he talks about the epics which he had planned on writing and went through a variety of possibilities. Is he going to write on Arthur's Britain, Knights of the Round Table, on tales of chivalry, etc. Milton talks about this in various places. Book 9 of Paradise Lost, obviously being the most famous, but I think on the Reason of Church Government, he also speaks of his plan to have written an epic from young years and early on. Well, Wordsworth, actually writing here in 1798, is only 28 years of age, so not very old to undertake an epic. But he finds it very difficult to come upon a subject matter, and in the end, he says that this is his lot. This is my lot, he writes, 261, for either still I find some imperfection in the chosen theme, or see of absolute accomplishment much wanting. So much wanting in myself that I recoil and droop, and seek repose in listlessness from vain perplexity, unprofitably traveling toward the grave, like a false steward who hath much received and renders nothing back. So he speaks now of his procrastination, I guess, his high theme, which he wishes to write, and yet he cannot find a subject matter suitable for it, and he moves around without any obvious subject matter to write upon. But eventually he will come upon something, and I will skip over several lines here and come to something that he does regard as his subject matter. Note that he'd referred in the lines 100 lines ago or something, a philosophic subject matter, and that is what he ends up landing upon. And the philosophic matter is the creation of his own mind, which is an interesting way of calling it as a philosophic subject matter. But he says that dust as we are, line 340, the immortal spirit grows like harmony in music. There is a dark, inscrutable workmanship that reconciles discordant elements, makes them cling together in one society. How strange that all the terrors, pains, and early miseries, regrets, vexations, lassitudes interfused within my mind should e'er have borne a part, and that a needful part in making up the calm existence that is mine when I am worthy of myself. Praise to the end, thanks to the means which nature deigned to employ, whether her fearless visiting or those that came with soft alarm, like hurtless light opening the peaceful clouds, or she may use severer interventions, ministry more palpable as best might suit her aim. Okay, so we see a variety of things which are worthy of note here in Wordsworth's introductory lines to the Prelude. One is the repeated difficulty of landing on the subject matter, his characteristic appeal to things outside himself, but also within himself, his characteristic, what his critics called his egotism, his focus upon himself, and yet at the same time his appeal to a sort of humility. Humility, because he claims that what comes to him is not his to claim. It's something that he experiences most profoundly, that he feels more strongly perhaps than other men, and yet it's not something that he can lay claim to himself because it is actually the gift of nature. So there is an element of humility there, and in all this, a devotion to a sort of service that he likens exactly to clerical service. But now he moves on to the scenes which I think we can see echoed in Tintern Abbey, and I will pick up the reading, and this is where the something like a discernible landscape appears for the first time. 357. One summer evening, led by her, nature, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cave, its usual home. You'll recognize this from the two-part prelude. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. For above was nothing but the stars and the gray sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as with voluntary power instinct upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars, I turned and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees or sea or sky, no colors of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Now, note there is an external landscape, and you will recognize that landscape from the two-part prelude, which he described for us there in pretty much the same terms, and yet he adds to them now. And it's the addition that is interesting. So it's further reflection than the reflection he made in the two-part prelude, and the reflection here is the one that connects it to something more like his romantic epic elaboration of early senses of the importance of those episodes. So these are what he calls the forms. Now, the forms, of course, are going to be familiar to those with any sort of a philosophical training or even simply reading of philosophy, the terminology of philosophers, a reference to Plato. And for Plato, these are a metaphysical realm of ideas, metaphysical reality, not something that is discernible in the physical, but a correspondence to that. Wordsworth likes to use the similar type of rather Platonic vocabulary. And in response to that, what he calls a darkness or a solitude or blank desertion. So this sense of emptiness, and yet it's connected with a sense of guilt at having stolen the boat that did not belong to him and having been pursued by this crag which loomed up for him and got bigger and bigger as he went away from it. It pursued him and grew greater so that he turned around and went back. This sense of guilt coupled with the natural landscape leads him to the idea that there is a presence, a moral presence in the natural world. And in response to that, he utters these lines: "Wisdom and spirit of the universe, thou soul that art the eternity of thought, that givest to forms and images a breath and everlasting motion. Not in vain by day or starlight, thus from my first dawn of childhood didst thou intertwine for me the passions that build up our human soul. Not with the mean and vulgar works of man, but with high objects and with enduring things, with life and nature, purifying thus the elements of feeling and of thought, and sanctifying by such discipline both pain and fear, until we recognize a grandeur in the beatings of the heart. Nor was this fellowship vouchsafed to me with stinted kindness. In November days, when vapors rolling down the valleys made a lonely scene more lonesome, among woods at noon, and mid the calm of summer nights, when by the margin of the trembling lake, beneath the gloomy hills, homeward I went, in solitude, such intercourse was mine. Mine was it in the fields both day and night, and by the waters all the summer long." So, Wordsworth now reflects in a way that he had not done in the two-part prelude on this being the experience that he has felt being the wisdom and spirit of the universe. And what we get in this is something like a correspondence to God in the experience of nature, in what Christians will talk about the general revelation. Wordsworth senses God most particularly. Now, insofar as he articulates an experience in nature of general revelation, most Christians say that there's nothing wrong with this. I would simply say in response to that, that there's a yes and no to it. When general revelation is referred to, it's not, as is commonly, and now since the Romantics, seen to be a reflection on the bare nature of the experience of the naked savage that the Romantics appeal to, but rather it is to dreams and myths and stories that seem to reflect archetypal human experiences, which we find in the stories and narratives of every culture. That's the revelation. It's not simply the natural world void of myth and story. It's not just the green stuff and the blue water and the air. These are not the sole focus of general revelation. In fact, I don't even think it's primarily what is intended by the reformers, for instance, when they're speaking of general revelation. They're not talking about what we can see by looking at the lake and the forest and the wind. They're thinking about what we can observe in cultures that don't know Christianity and yet seem to have stories that are very similar. That's what they're speaking of as general revelation. And also, of course, the sense of the grandeur which we can see in nature. I'm not denying that. I'm saying that it's a broader category, is general revelation. But Wordsworth reduces it away from those stories and archetypal folk tales and mythologies and so forth, and reduces it more to the bare empirical world. And we tend to follow him in that, and I think it's deeply problematic. And in that sense, then we need to be, to some degree, on our guard when even Christians appeal to general revelation, and by that simply mean the natural world of trees and rocks and forests and lakes, etc., and air. Not that these things aren't a reflection of God's handiwork. Of course they are. But there's more to it than that, I think, that is meant by general revelation than simply those things. Anyway, he moves on here, and I haven't moved on very far in my my introductory lecture on the Prelude, and I'm not surprised in that sense, because there's always a lot to say at the outset in terms of general observations. So I will skip over some of these things, but you will notice that many of these passages will come familiar to those of us who have read the two-part Prelude. And I will pick it up towards the conclusion of the book first, and read one final passage before moving on to the school time, which is the subject matter of book second. And he said, so he says in line 6:12, I began my story early. Reflecting back on what he's just said. Not misled, I trust, by an infirmity of love, for days disowned my memory. Fancying flowers where none, not even the sweetest, do or can survive, for him at least, whose dawning day they cheered. Nor will it seem to thee, O friend, now he avers to his friend Coleridge, to whom he has dedicated this grand poem. Nor will it seem to thee, O friend, so prompt in sympathy, that I have lengthened out with fond and feeble tongue a tedious tale. Meanwhile, my hope has been that I might fetch invigorating thoughts from former years, might fix the wavering balance of my mind, and happily meet reproaches too, whose power may spur me on, in manhood now mature, to honorable toil. Yet should these hopes prove vain, and thus should neither I be taught to understand myself, nor thou to know with better knowledge how the heart was framed of him thou lovest, need I dread from thee harsh judgments, if the song be loath to quit those recollected hours that have the charm of visionary things, those lovely forms and sweet sensations that throw back our life, and almost make remotest infancy a visible scene on which the sun is shining. One end at least hath been attained. My mind hath been revived. So if he's failed to describe the early movements in his infancy of this sense of himself as a moral and even a metaphysical being, a being that's connected to a nature, the nature that pervades all thought and all objects of all thought, if he has failed to describe that adequately, nonetheless, he has invigorated himself in the process. And after all, the development of his own mind was the purpose of recounting the Prelude to demonstrate this. And so he says, one end at least hath been attained, my mind hath been revived. And if this genial mood desert me not, forthwith shall be brought down through later years the story of my life. The road lies plain before me. Remember, I talked about the prospect, Mount Pisgah, Pisgah, the mount upon which Moses observed in prospect the promised land to which he could not enter, and which Adam and Eve at the end of Paradise Lost, when they are looking out from Eden, looking about into the realms into which providence will lead them as their guide, and they, through wandering steps and slow through Eden, wove their solitary ways. For Milton, likewise for Wordsworth, the road lies plain before him, he says. 'Tis a scheme single and of determined bounds, and hence I choose it rather at this time than work of ampler or more varied argument, where I might be discomfited and lost, and certain hopes are with me, that to thee this labor will be welcome, honored friend. And so he goes over the recollections of his child and the beginnings of school time. I will skip over much of the discussion of school time, but I do want to raise a couple of things here. And one of them are on his concern about the capacity for discursive thought, and the way discursive thought in some ways gets in the way of the sense of his immortal self. And so what we will note in Wordsworth, which is characteristic of the Romantics, is this sense that they want to laud the imagination and the feeling thought of the imagination over and against the faculty of reason. And so we get this characteristic dichotomy, which people accept thereafter as the way in which we ought to view the world, which is that it's either reasonable or it's imaginative. It either has reason or it has feeling. It either is characterized by people who operate the way Mr. Spock does, or it is characterized by people that act like Bones McCoy, an emotive character, or if you want a next generation Star Trek analogy of the Mr. Data to Counselor Troy, the empath. So people who are in touch with their feelings, or people who are in touch with their minds. These two things, as if these were the two ways in which we primarily operate. And to some degree, there's some legitimacy to that, insofar as even the ancient world acknowledges that the vast majority of people are motivated by their passions, and that all too few are led by their mind and the pursuit of the intellect, namely the philosophers. And yet there's a sense in which by democratizing the field of education, that what has been lost is precisely the realm of reason. And I, for my part, am not going to be very happy that the poets are going to throw their lot in with the irrationalists. And I'm not even sure that Wordsworth's own views are, strictly speaking, irrational. He's making a logical argument. He has read books and he writes with terrific capacity that understands not only logic, but the syntax and the choice of words that will allow him powerful expression. So we have no irrationalism here in Wordsworth, but we do have the characteristic antipathy to a certain understanding of reason, which is reason devoid of the freedom to choose. And that's, I think, the primary objection, is this dead, sterile, inhuman, mechanistic, deterministic universe of the 18th century. This is the primary objection, and they associate that with reason. Now, this is the problem for contemporary philosophers in the rationalist tradition, or even in the empiricist tradition of the Anglo-American philosophical tradition, is they don't understand what is meant by reason here, and for that matter, neither do those who are going to represent the Romantics. They don't see that reasoning per se is not being thrown out. It's the determinism that the Romantics despise and reject and oppose at every turn. But let me come to that passage in which he turns upon discursive reasoning and speaks of it as an officious slave. He says, when he was young, those incidental charms, line 198, book 2, which first attached my heart to rural objects day by day grew weaker as he grew older. Something he describes in the Immortality Ode. As he grew older, his attachment to the rural objects grew weaker, and his feelings and his sense of immortality in those things lost its power. And he says, and I hasten on to tell how nature, intervenient till this time and secondary, now at length was sought for her own sake. But who shall parcel out his intellect by geometric rules, split like a province into round and square? Who knows the individual hour in which his habits were first sown, even as a seed? Who that shall point as with a wand and say, this portion of the river of my mind came from yon fountain? Thou, my friend, art one more deeply read in thy own thoughts. To thee, science appears but what in truth she is, not as our glory and our absolute boast, but as a succedaneum, succedaneum, and a prop to our infirmity. What's a succedaneum? It's a substitute. Is a substitute and a prop to our infirmity. No officious slave art thou of that false secondary power by which we multiply distinctions, then deem that our puny boundaries are things that we perceive, and not that we have made. To thee, Coleridge, unblinded by these formal arts, the unity of all hath been revealed, and thou wilt doubt, with me less aptly skilled than many are to range the faculties in scale and order, class the cabinet of their sensation, an involuble phrase run through the history and birth of each as of a single independent thing. Hard task, vain hope. So he talks about how the organizing power of rationalization and the categorization, which we see is characteristic of the 18th century taxonomy and so forth. So this is a class, the phylum, the genus, the species, and they will do this of every man. There's a manner of organization of things which talks about these organizations as if they themselves were objects and could not be disputed, and regards science thereby as something that cannot be questioned. So there's the early onset of what C.S. Lewis will call scientism, the belief in science because science says that it's science. There's I'd say a nascent criticism of that view right here, and an unwillingness to critique the very categories that have been produced to allow us to think as if they were not open to question themselves. And so Wordsworth's critique here seems to me rather valid. I will leave it off with that perhaps in that section and move forward to the book third. Now, book third moves from his young years, which will be the years in which he describes in the two-part Prelude. Remember, he leaves off at 17, and that's really when he goes up to Cambridge as an undergraduate student. In book third, he comes to the world of not only of books, but the place in which Milton studied as well. And so there's some element of obviously probably excitement there as he comes up to King's College and to the place of the Cam. But Wordsworth's actually a student of St. John's College, Cambridge, just for note yourselves. And he goes on, where am I going to pick this up? I only have a section here. I'll read a segment and then we'll leave it off for today, and I will have to pick it up with book 4 next time, book 4, telling of his summer vacation, but of his time at Cambridge. And I'll just say in general, he was highly disappointed with his university studies and did not do well. Did not give himself over to the disciplines of study in the university, but in particular, he objected to the Newtonian deterministic way in which they regarded all things. He questioned it, he doubted it, and he would not submit to it. And he says that he was the dreamer, and they he saw the dream, and he roved around, and the evangelist St. John, my patron, was. So he was in St. John's College. 3 Gothic courts are his, and then in the first was my abiding place, a nook obscure right underneath. The college kitchens made a humming sound, less tunable than bees, but hardly less industrious, with shrill notes of sharp command and scolding intermixed. Near me hung Trinity's loquacious clock, who never let the quarters, night or day, slip by him unproclaimed. He's talking about the clock chiming at the quarter hour, and told the hours twice over with a male and female voice. Her pealing organ was my neighbor too, and from my pillow, looking forth by light of moon or favoring stars, I could behold the antechapel where the statue stood of Newton, with his prism and silent face, the marble index of a mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought, alone. Of college labors, of the lecturer's room, all studded round as thick as chairs could stand, with loyal students faithful to their books, half and half idlers, hardly recusants, and honest dunces, of important days' examinations, when the man was weighed as in a balance, of excessive hopes, trembling withal, and commendable fears, small jealousies, and triumphs, good or bad, let others that know more speak as they know. Such glory was but little sought by me, and little won. Yet from the first crude days of settling time in this untried abode, I was disturbed, at times by prudent thoughts, wishing to hope without a hope, some fears about my future worldly maintenance, and more than all, a strangeness in the mind, a feeling that I was not for that hour, not for that place. But wherefore be cast down? For, not to speak of reason and her pure reflective acts to fix the moral law deep in the conscience, nor of Christian hope bowing her head before her sister faith as one far mightier, hither I had come, bear witness truth, endowed with holy powers and faculties, whether to work or feel. Oft when the dazzling show no longer new had ceased to dazzle, ofttimes did I quit my comrades, leave the crowd, buildings and groves, and as I paced alone the level fields, far from those lovely sights and sounds sublime with which I had been conversant, the mind drooped not, but there into herself returning with prompt rebound seemed fresh as heretofore. At least I more distinctly recognized her native instincts. Let me dare to speak a higher language. Say that now I felt what independent solaces were mine, to mitigate the injurious sway of place, of circumstance, how far soe'er had changed in youth, or to be changed in manhood's prime. Or for the few who shall be called to look over the long shadows in our evening years, ordain precursors to the night of death, as if awakened, summoned, roused, constrained, I look for universal things. And in that he says that he ascends to such community with highest truth, a track pursuing not untrod before, from strict analogies by thought supplied, or consciousness not to be subdued to every natural form. And he says that as he goes along this, he says, I gave a moral life, 132. I saw them feel, or link them to some feeling. The great mass lay bedded in a quickening soul, and all that I beheld respired with inward meaning. Add that whate'er of terror or of love or beauty nature's daily face put on, from transitory passion unto this, I was as sensitive as waters are to the sky's influence. In a kindred mood of passion, was obedient as a lute that waits upon the touches of the wind, unknown, unthought of, yet I was most rich. I had a world about me, 'twas my own. I made it, for it only lived to me, and to the God who sees into the heart. Such sympathies, though rarely, were betrayed by outward gestures and by invisible look. So this sense of himself, which was awakened in his infancy, remained with him at Cambridge, but it was not actually fostered by Cambridge. We will come to this subject matter a little bit later on, where he will contrast the effect of the world of books on his development of his mind with the effect of nature, and he will prefer, to give it away, what we already could probably guess, he will prefer the effect and the influence of the realm of nature to that of books and the realm of the thought of others. And in that, there's a troubling tendency, which is more a tendency that later generations will follow than Wordsworth himself, to regard books as something that can be dispensed with in the development of one's mind. Mr. Wordsworth was most certainly an avid and well-read man. But we'll leave it off at that, and I shall see you next time. Thank you.